My name is Joanne Patti Munisteri. I was the first female. I was awarded a Circumnavigator's Fellowship in 1973. The original topic that I submitted was on a different subject area, but because I was the first female, they asked me to change mine to be the perceptions of an American female to her Eastern European and Soviet contemporaries, because I was mostly behind the Iron Curtain. At that time, it was only Georgetown University that they came to, and the New York chapter, and Ray Dinsmore was my mentor, and the New York chapter came down to Washington, D.C. for the final interview. I was in the Foreign Service School at Georgetown. I believe at that time, Circumnavigators Foundation grant was only open to Foreign Service students. My concentration was in international relations. I had a double major in international economics and a minor in ecology. Well, the grant was for only males. You have to remember that in 1973, my graduating class, especially, there was a quota of no more than, I think it was 12%. It was 10%, I think, in 1972, and they maybe raised it to 12% by 1974, but a minority of females anyway in the Foreign Service School. The only schools that had at least equal amounts of women were Languages and Linguistics, College of Languages and Linguistics, and the nursing school. The college wasn't even 30% women, I think, maybe 20% women. And the Foreign Service School was less. So they had a lot of scholarships for different things, but they were never open to women. But I was the first woman ever to be on the Philodemic Society, the debating team at Georgetown. I had won nationals in high school at Stanford University, and I got a partial scholarship to Georgetown to be on the debate team. That was when Unger was the debate coach. And I was also in Model United Nations, and I was the only, I know I was the first woman, and might have been the only female to be a committee head of Model United Nations and a number of other activities. I was in the student government. I was treasurer of Georgetown student government. I started the Guts buses there my junior year. So a lot of things that they just assumed I would be a boy, a male. And so in my life, this has happened a couple of times. You know, I just had a sort of inner voice calling, say, I really think I can win this scholarship, and I'm just going to put I just put J Munisteri, put all my activities, put in my proposal, and let's see what happens. And when I was chosen for the panel, when they came down from New York, it was in Dean Peter Crow's office. All the finalists were sitting there. I was sitting there. Ray Dinsmore, I really remember him walking in. He's a big, tall, commanding presence. And he looked at me and he said something like, "Well, hello, young lady. What are you doing here?" You know. And I said, "Well, I'm waiting for my interview, sir." And he said, "What's your name?" You know, and I said, "Joanne Munisteri." And he just started laughing, a deep laugh. He said, "Oh, this is going to be fun." Because apparently they had already decided I was going to be the winner. But when they determined that Jane Munisteri, when I walked in and realized as a female, they decided to give 2 that year. That was the first year they gave 2. And my fellowship was abbreviated 1. And they had me change my topic area too. To justify having be a female, they had me study females. Yeah, they wouldn't let me go all around the world because they didn't think a female could do that. I had some contacts that were arranged for me by Mr. Dinsmore and the Circumnavigators Club, and some of the Foreign Service professors helped me as well. So I was given some briefings before I left, and 2 envelopes. I never did know what was in the content. It was probably introductions to both my first contact in Romania. She was an interpreter for the American wrestling team, which was there at the same time I was for the first week I was on my grant. And the last one in Moscow, in Russia. So she was fantastic, Luminista. I doubt she's still alive now. This is under Ceausescu, so it was a very different way to travel, and no internet, no cell phones, no other points of contact. And she took me all sorts of places, both tourist places like the museums, but also I got to travel a little bit with the American wrestling team and saw a little bit about the sports facilities. I went to salons, which was a great place. She was the interpreter, where you go where all women are and people are a little bit more relaxed. And yes, mostly it was just seeing daily life there to start off with in Bucharest, which is very, very different than the United States when I went there in 1970. At that time, it was easier to go to Buda, which is the elder part of the city rather than Pesti. And I was again, I was in contact with people who were in the sporting events. So I got to see some sporting events there, universities, it was a summer vacation. So it was just really walking around the university and seeing some of the events that they had there. I didn't spend too much time in Hungary, and most of the time I spent in Buda. I traveled there by bicycle and by car. That there were so many female street sweepers. They mostly held the lower rung of what would be considered, jobs that were considered menial. I will say that even before I went to the Soviet countries, in that time, this was during the Vietnam War, and similar to today in many respects, there was a fascination with communism, and we had a lot of, now I look back now, we definitely had a lot of infiltration and indoctrination by various people in different ways, from the Berrigan brothers to overt Communist Party people. And it sounded very good when you're 19, everything according to their needs, everybody according to their abilities, and everything would be paid. And it was considered a paradise for workers, especially once you got to Russia. And I really believed that. There wasn't the media like there is today. So when I got there, I was shocked. It was, the buildings hadn't really been restored since World War II in many of these places. And yes, women had jobs, all right, but they were the lowest jobs, and there wasn't very much choice of anything from food to fashion. It was like going from color to black and white in many ways, the first two country journey. I believe I did make a detour to Austria. I did go to Austria just for a few days. And I remember that because I was on a hydrofoil on the Danube River. And again, that was crossing over to the west. And the contrast, even in people's clothes and people's housing, was so remarkable, remarkably different from the Soviet countries to the. And then when I went to I first went to West Germany and crossed over through Checkpoint Charlie. Angela Davis, interestingly enough, happened to be speaking that week. She was a very avowed communist, very articulate speaker too. And I went to see her in East Berlin. She had a huge crowd. It was, I mean, I think it's hard for people who have grown up, let's say, in the last 35 years to realize that in those times, there was only really live entertainment or live lectures. I mean, there was television, but it's not like today where you have a plethora of choices of what you're going to watch on a screen and you don't have to go anywhere. People really would go out for concerts, for events, for speeches, and for an American, and at that time, a Black American, to come over to the United States, from the United States to a Soviet country, was unusual. And so there were all sorts of people. There were thousands of people there. And there again, just the contrast going through Checkpoint Charlie from the east to the west was stark. And many people would ask me through interpreters, please take me with you back to West Germany. I do remember that vividly. In Holland, I again traveled by bicycle from Breda, as I recall. I traveled in a number of different places. It's a very flat country and very easy to go by bicycle, especially then. It was quite safe. And there I met women who were working at that time in organic kinds of agriculture and trying to make as much as possible of the, they don't have much of a landform for all of their population. So that was a very interesting side trip there to go see those farms and to do it by bicycle. Both in Sweden and then later on, when I went back to Norway and worked there, they are very unique countries, I would say, and Denmark to a certain extent too. I would say they have it's kind of a stereotype, but some of the stereotypes hold true, that they're kind of a reserved people, and they're not very self-congratulatory like some other countries. And so they quietly gave women more and more responsibilities and more positions that were not, and to a great extent still are not, open in the same way in other Western countries. I found the Norwegian, Swedes, and Finnish in a different way to be very sort of no nonsense and very capable. Yes, of course we can do Finland. And in Finland, I was at a conference for physicists. I got an invitation to go there. And that was the first time I really saw a delegation from both the West and the East. And there were some female physicists there. Now my paternal grandmother, Joanne Patti Munisteri, had been a physicist. So it interested me, and it was also in English as well as in Finnish and Russian. I went by ship from Krupsayak on the Russian ship. That was an experience of itself because the Russian ship was very programmed. You couldn't have any real free time. They structured it so you got up early in the morning and you had exercises. Everything was in Russian, and you had then something to eat. Then you had promenades, but only in certain places on the ship. But in the afternoon, I'd met a British woman. I look back now and don't know if it was actually such a chance meeting, actually. But it was supposedly a chance meeting. And we had hours of conversation. She was much older than me at the time. And she told me a lot about the Soviet Union and a little bit about what to expect. And we just also about life and what I wanted to do in my life. And that trip lasted a couple of days on the ship. And then we came into Tallinn, which at that time was part of the Soviet Union. It was quite a contrast from Finland to Estonia, even though it's not that far geographically. Again, the general tenor of women, once I got to Russia, was they were quite, in the 70s, they were quite proud of being Russian. That wouldn't be the case today in Estonia, I think. But yes, there was a kind of a pride, and I just did notice they were a lot more pushy, is the word that comes to mind, than in the other Soviet Union countries, which they themselves didn't necessarily have a revolution. That was just thrust upon them in Romania and Hungary and Poland. But when I got to Russia, there was a different atmosphere, and women were proud of being Russian and went out of their way to really show me. I went to Petronovitz, and they took me to different historical places and previous palaces, always making the point. At that time, I was speaking French. I spoke French quite well at that point, and my interpreter spoke French better than English. French was still very much used in Russia at that time, even though it was a quote unquote aristocratic language, more than English in the 70s. So they would take me to these old palaces and restored aristocratic places, on the one hand, touting them as their great tourist attractions, and on the other hand, denigrating them for the fact that they were bourgeois or in the old aristocracy. It was constant propaganda. Sometimes I thought they protested too much, as they say. From there, I went to Leningrad it was Leningrad, and it's Leningrad again. um, and St. Petersburg for a while, and then Leningrad. So that was surprising to me, just geographically, because I don't know why, but I just never realized it was like Venice and that there were so many different canals. I don't know if you've ever been there, but yes, they had sort of like a boat buses and hundreds of bridges going over the water. A very more European feeling city to me than Moscow. It was interesting in they had, I'm trying to remember, it wasn't the Metropole, it was another hotel I was staying at, but they had there still in the 1970s, the invitation that the German army had for Hitler and the German army to come there to the ballroom for a feast, which of course never happened because they never got that far. But that was still a point of pride for them at that time. And when I walked into the hotel, I somebody translated for me. Again, there were lots of women doing lots of work, and some of the women, through an interpreter, had told me that they didn't have time to spend with their children because daycare at that point was almost forced once the children were 3 or 4. You were encouraged to have a lot of children. And even when I went back to Russia in 2011, 2012, they were still paying people, especially if you had more than one child. But the attitude was, why should we have more children? Because we pretty much give them up to the state. That was then, and that was still in 2012. So I've been told people would follow me. And again, I had some people come up and talk to me in a halting English that I wondered at the time. I look back now and go, I mean, now I know so much more, but when I just turned 20, and there wasn't as much media as there is now. So I went to, I had studied dance, and later on in my life, I was in the performing arts professionally. So I was very interested in going to see the Bolshoi, which I did, the ballet, and see the Museum of the People, and just walk around the streets. I had more latitude walking, and the metro was absolutely gorgeous. As I remember the first time I was there, I couldn't believe it compared to New York. There were chandeliers there. There was art hung there. There was no graffiti. One thing that really struck me there was the truss system. At that time, almost everything was on the truss system, that if you went through a turnstile, went on a bus, nobody checked up on you, but everybody was sort of watching anyway. So I didn't see anybody not putting in the money, but the bus drivers were women, and in most of the shops, the vendors were women. There wasn't much choice in many of the shops. When I went to GUM in 1973, which they touted as this wonderful place where you could buy all these different goods from all over, it was very disappointing. And when I went back in 2011, you had Gucci, you had Massimo Dutti, it had really changed. That I was supposed to stay longer, but it's funny because people say, oh, don't worry, at that time it was the KGB, now it's the FSB. Nobody's going to come and kidnap you or do anything like that. You'll be protected. We have people watching out for you in ways you won't know. But sure enough, I got a knock on my door a week before I was supposed to leave. And 3 KGB, I guess they were, a hotel guy and somebody else as well, were there and said, essentially, you have 10 minutes to pack and we're taking you to the airport. You have to remember, there's no cell phones, there's no anything like that. I couldn't contact anybody. And I asked them why, and they said, no, you have to come with us. And I really thought at that point, I wasn't sure if I was going to make it back to the United States. And I was very conscious that I was the first female, and many, many people did not want me to have this fellowship. And so I was worried that there was going to be trouble, and then, no other females would get to go if I didn't get back safely. So they took me to the airport. They didn't really say anything. put me on a plane and sent me to Krakow, Poland. That's pretty much the end of my circumnavigators. When I got to Krakow, then I called and said, look, this has happened. And I wasn't told why I had to leave Russia. I guess they thought I was spying or something. And so I stayed in Krakow for a few days, and then I came back both parts. I mean, I was quite afraid to go back to Russia after that. And then later on in my life, I have been back in Russia, and I completely changed my mind the second time I was there. So depending on the circumstances and your frame of mind, I knew that it was important to continually be open to experiences from people and firsthand experience, not just from media. And at that time too, I was to present at the United Nations, which I did, but that was the day that the 1973 Middle East War started. So after my speech, all the bells went off in New York and at the United Nations, and our meeting got kind of cut short because of very serious incidents. I would say when I was preparing my paper, one thing I realized was I didn't have the kind of training I wanted, which I've had later on in my life, to understand the human domain a little bit more. And I wanted to take as many courses as possible that told me more about the natural world. That's why I sort of changed some of my electives at that point to have more biology and ecology. And the next year, I did a preliminary master's program in ecology in Central America, because while politics were important to me, certainly at the Foreign Service School, and economics very important, I also realized knowing about the natural world and where I was for me. Model United Nations I was still in, and those duties accelerated. And at that time, I haven't followed it so well recently, but Georgetown and Harvard were pretty much the two top universities in Model United Nations. And we were up at Harvard. And at the United Nations, they actually had the Model United Nations in New York, I believe it was in 1974. And there you had actually, I met, people who are now, let's say, the ambassadors from various countries. I mean, Omar Rafay was one of the students at Harvard. Some of the sheikh's sons from Saudi were at Harvard. I mean, we were all in 19 or 20 and, full of idealism about how the world was going to get along. And it was great in a way. The last year. And then I was chosen for the special program in psychocybernetics with Dr. Mizior and Dr. Jack Schumann, Dr. Alexander Christaki, and General Haig was my mentor with that. So I was taken to all sorts of special places in my senior year and subjected to all different kinds of testing. And I don't think I would have had as much confidence in those trainings and courses had I not gone by myself on the trip in the year before or the summer before. I mean, I certainly stayed in contact with Ray Dinsmore, and then a Japanese American man, I think his name was Watabe. And they invited me to a number of events. Isn't it funny, I wasn't able to qualify to become a circumnavigator at that point, like the other fellowship winners, because I hadn't gone around the world because my fellowship had been abbreviated. So I couldn't be a member, but they invited me to a number of events. And it was at a special event in New York years later that my life changed significantly, going to Australia and New Zealand. And I was invited to that event by Ray Dinsmore, who knew the ambassador from Australia and had invited me to that particular. I love their mission statement, which is to leave the world a little better than you found it. They don't say make a huge difference. They're kind of realistic. They say a little better. If you can leave each place that you've been a little better than you found it, that's quite an accomplishment in many places. And so I do believe in that mission. I take it personally when I go to a place. I don't necessarily try to change them. I just try to improve something that they want improved. And the other part is that you meet all different kinds of people. I mean, I'm still on a Facebook page with them, for example. I still get invited to certain chapters, and I just have not been in the country, but I do want to be more involved in the educational foundation pretty soon, because I do think it really literally can change lives for the better. I think more than ever, there's great benefits of the technology we have in terms of communication, but there's for the generations coming up, and I see it now, having been in public education as well, elementary through high school as well as higher education. I think all of us who've been there, especially the first 10 of us or so, you know, first of all, the circumnavigators showed such confidence in a way by choosing people who were 19 or 20 years old and having the confidence to say, okay, you're off, pretty much, you're off by yourself and handle it. I mean, and there's no Google saying, what do I do in this situation? I mean, you have to quickly make decisions and trust on your sense of observation. I knew I had to hone my observation skills more. I would say don't go for the quote unquote popular topics. Go for something that really interests you, but not just you, something that can be of use to other people and that will last over the next few years. If it's something that's just timely now, that may not, be the best topic to devote your time to. And also be realistic. I mean, it's much easier now because you can communicate with people even before you go by Zoom or other ways. But be judicious in who your contacts are going to be, so you don't waste your time. You don't have a lot of time. You think it's a lot of time. I thought, 40, 50 days, that's a long time. It's not for certain kinds of projects at all. It's just a taste. So try and have your network beforehand. And if you haven't, I'm not sure if they choose people who haven't traveled before. If you haven't traveled outside the United States before, I would say do a couple of trips in the United States to places you have never been before and just see how it is going by yourself. It's very different than traveling with somebody else. Wow, 50 years, yeah. And I've been with it since almost the beginning. I think it's excellent that it's continued. And Ray Dinsmore was such an important person in my life and mentor in my life. And I do hope that I can be that to somebody else coming through. I'll have the time more after this year. And part of the reason I wrote the book is for people who are thinking of going into these humanitarian areas. Not much is really written about day-to-day life in that. And I would also say that in this day of cancel culture, it's important to be able to have other people's viewpoints. And Circumnavigators Fellowship sometimes is known as only certain kinds of people, but when you actually get to know them, I know when I went to some receptions, even in my 20s, when you're in your 20s, you think people in their 60s, what did they know? What did they do? Doesn't have any relationship to me. It had a lot of relationship to me. And not just for travel tips, I'm talking about life tips, business tips, them asking questions that really made me think, what is my purpose in life? One thing about Georgetown when I went there, and I think the Kennedy Center for Bioethics and a few of the other programs there made me conscious from a very early age that to whom much is given, much is expected. And what are you going to do with these gifts, with education, with the gift of the fellowship? How are you going to use it? It's not just for you. Yes, this is my new book, just came out a few weeks ago, published by Defiance Press of Texas. And it's called Traveling Off the X. And it starts with my circumnavigators trip in 1973 and goes through my life through 2016. I've had a very unusual career in the sense that I didn't necessarily plan how my career has gone. And if I look back now in my life, I'm almost 70, I can see a lot of things at the time I didn't think made a lot of sense, or I thought I'd never go back there. Like I'd never go back to Russia. I'd never go back to Afghanistan. But as life has turned out, or I'd never be in Alaska. That didn't happen. I have been those places. And sometimes you do get, often you don't, but sometimes you get a second chance as well about programs. So you don't know where life will lead you. And as I say, faith is a very big part of my life. Not organized religion per se, but faith and following certain guidelines. And I will say the ways that people communicate, having gone and been a performing artist, has really helped. I mean, I think I've danced and sung in almost every country I've been in. And usually that's one of the ways that we have broken through barriers. I've danced with the Cossacks in Russia. I've played flute in the deserts in Saudi Arabia, played harmonica in Ukraine. I mean, music and the arts reach people all over the world.